Wonderful. Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Bounet-Jailly, and I'm the host of this series on the European Union at the University of Victoria. I'm speaking from the unceded Songhees land, and I will say that although I'm not working at UVic, I want to do the territory acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanich people whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. On a beautiful day of spring 2021, we're so happy to live here. And we are delighted today to have a talk by Paul Schur. Paul is a professor at the University of Victoria in the Department of Economics. And he's well known, he's very respected in our community, and I'm delighted to have him come and speak to us about some of the research that he's doing right now. Paul, the floor is yours. Thanks again for doing this.
Thank you very much. And it's totally a pleasure to be speaking in this seminar program. Quite looking forward to it. I have to say, it's a fantastic opportunity for me, as you will notice, because the research is about, of course, the title suggests that I have all kinds of interesting, cool facts about expert opinions on fiscal solidarity. And I do not yet have that information. But the survey is almost done and about to be sent out. So if anybody here in this group is interested in helping sort of finesse the final bits before the thing can be sent out tomorrow or Thursday, that will be really awesome. Can I ask a logistical question here? Am I the only host of this seminar, Amanda?
No, I am also a host.
You're co-hosting. So yeah, because I've been admitting people from the waiting room, but maybe you can focus on that.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, total pleasure. I think the survey makes sense. I'm super excited about it. It's a project that in a way sort of started small and then became bigger as we build it, for reasons that I will explain as I go over the presentation. But I'm excited, and I feel that this can deliver more than just a single paper, and maybe you guys can help me identify other ideas that can be explored with the data which is forthcoming. With that said, let me just share my screen here. And I'm sharing, I should be sharing screen one here, then I can flip easier between screens. So here, now you can see my PowerPoint, I suppose. If I maximize this and then start to show from the beginning. Are you now seeing sort of the yellow screen here that presents the title?
Awesome. Yes, it works super well.
Nice. So fiscal solidarity across the euro area, evidence from an expert survey. Let me just start by talking a little bit about the title. So what do we mean by fiscal solidarity? It essentially means assistance to EU governments that experience financial difficulties by other EU governments. And this is a hot topic. You must have heard last year with the COVID crisis hitting that there was an EU-wide response. This EU-wide response would be an act of fiscal solidarity, because it basically involved EU member states basically supporting the center, the EU, right? And the EU distributing more money over the member states. So that's one form in which you can sort of show acts of fiscal solidarity. Another way would be simply, let's say the Dutch government transfers money to the German government. You don't see that very often, but it would be another way. That would be a direct possible transfer. But the way it was established in what is called Next Generation EU was that the EU temporarily had an increase in the budget over the next 3 years of 750 billion euros and distributed that over the countries. Right? So basically an enlargement of the fiscal capacity of the EU, and that which is then used to buttress governments that experience financial difficulties in this case due to the pandemic. Now, what is the motivation? So during these negotiations, I had extensive exchanges, email exchanges and Zoom calls with my co-author on this paper, Pompeo Della Posta. And these were, in a way, very strange and exciting conversations, because we're both, my co-author and I are both PhDs in economics, both have PhDs in economics. We both work at a university. We even have, in part, the same background. He grew up in Italy, and I grew up in the Netherlands, but we both wrote our PhDs at, Steve Walleness has been admitted, we both wrote our PhDs at the European University Institute. So we have a lot in common. And still, during these conversations, it turned out that there were many disconnects between us. And there were disconnects about what I would call are quite straightforward terms that everybody uses during those negotiations. So I'm going to give you an example, Eurobond. So during the negotiations for months, especially sort of, I would say in April, May, there was a lot of talk about Eurobonds. And it turned out that my co-author and I had very different ideas of what Eurobonds meant. And to be sure, if you then scan the literature, it turns out that there are people that hold a quite broad view of what Eurobonds mean, and other people who hold a more narrow view of what the meaning is of Eurobonds. But obviously, whatever you have in your head matters for a debate. And if two quote unquote experts like myself and my co-author, who happen to hold PhDs in economics, have misunderstandings about Eurobonds, then it's not impossible that even negotiators in Brussels that represent their countries and that negotiate packages like Next Generation EU also have misunderstandings on Eurobonds. And similarly, we also had misunderstandings about what was even meant by solidarity, or in this context, fiscal solidarity. And so an example would be that he would stress, well, it's obvious that COVID-19 is a major pandemic that hit the EU and that basically hits Italy quite tough, because Italy has a high debt and might have troubles, foresees troubles to sort of attract funding on the capital markets. So it's obvious that sort of money should be transferred to Italy, no strings attached. Whereas the perspective of myself and maybe of many people in the Netherlands would be, well, hang on, support is one thing, but no strings attached. Are you serious? So in other words, we were discussing the concept of what is called conditionality, right? When loans are extended, is it reasonable to sort of ask for conditions for those loans? And is it reasonable to even discuss pricing of the loans, right? Maybe to say, hey, Italy, yes, we will provide funding, but the cost is 2% or 2.5%. Or when you ever repay any government debt, this debt has to be repaid first. And he found it totally unreasonable that in a pandemic, in a crisis, you would talk about such conditionality. So we also had a disconnect in what stories are stressed. We had a disconnect in what were the benefits of the EU for countries like Italy and Germany. And he felt in particular that Germany has an incredible deal when it comes to EMU, whereas Italy hardly benefits. I said, well, you know, but there's a lot of possible benefits from EMU. And I remember that before EMU started, the interest rate on Italian debt was very high, and it lowered substantially in the run-up to the introduction of the euro. And that must be a benefit. Oh yeah, no, he mentioned, yeah, no, I guess you're right. But sort of basically he stressed that Germany has had this export-led growth, and the Netherlands will be the same, so have benefited from essentially fixed exchange rate and export-led growth, and have been able to supply the European Union with their products without there being an exchange rate correction. And I said, well, that's a good point. But on the other hand, the rules were the same for every nation. So why didn't you guys do that in Italy, right? So that is what I mean with the disconnect in what macroeconomic stories or what macroeconomic theories are stressed in this context. And again, it's two experts talking that in itself have a quite pro-European attitude, and you wonder whether there should be even a possibility for there to be these debates, right? Yeah. So that is basically the main inspiration. And then initially we were trying to sort of tease out, okay, what can we learn about? Can we sort of do a survey that figures out what are the concepts in the heads of people when they speak of things like Eurobonds and solidarity? And then we thought, well, it's actually also nice to sort of know the attitudes of experts regarding solidarity. And then we figured, well, yeah, but these attitudes depend on a lot of things, including your political opinion about things, including the macroeconomic model you have in your head, and including a lot of factors. So when we properly want to map the ideas of fiscal solidarity that people have, or the opinions on these things, we need to actually control for a lot of factors in order to measure it. And then after controlling for all other relevant factors, it would be really interesting to see if nationality still matters. Or alternatively, it's not nationality that really matters, but it is the other factors that may be sort of, that there are patterns, for example, in terms of political opinion in, say, Germany and Italy that differ, right? So the broader aim of this talk is, and I'm just reading from the slides, are there disconnects among politicians and other decision makers? That's the broader aim, but of course, politicians basically say what they wanted based on the decisions they take, right? So if a politician has, or if a group of government officials has taken a certain decision, they will always argue that that was what they liked as an outcome. I mean, there are exceptions here, right? I should not generalize too much, but you get the point, right? But we can find experts and we can figure out what opinions are of these experts, for example, academics. And we also know that experts have have leverage to inform decision makers. So it's maybe these experts that have a critical role. On the other hand, experts are not living in isolation. They also read newspapers. Newspapers are by and large still national in the European Union. So maybe experts too are influenced by the going stories in the newspapers, etc., etc. So then the specific aim of the survey was, are experts thinking similarly about macroeconomic policy, about EMU and the benefits of EMU and fiscal solidarity? And we wanted to focus on the euro area, because in the euro area, everybody has the same exchange rates. And presumably also sort of the countries of the euro area have chosen for the closest form of cooperation, economic and political cooperation. So that's where fiscal solidarity is presumably the strongest, if it's there at all, right? For today, let's focus on that specific one leading question, and that is, does fiscal solidarity mean the same across the euro area? So this is a nice moment for a pause. As you know, I'm an economist. In economics, people just blabber and ask questions all over the place throughout the seminar, and that's what I'm used to. So it actually is reassuring. So if you have any questions, fire them off at any time, but maybe now is also a very good moment.
I'm happy to pose one if you want, Paul.
Absolutely.
Maybe it'll lead a little bit to more. So because I wrote about this a little bit and I followed a little bit this idea around, this new package, which is extraordinary because obviously the EU level for now is basically carrying a debt, right? It's quite amazing that the states have basically agreed that the EU level would carry a debt. And the debt is basically now shared. And so one of the thinking that that if I compare this to Canada, we have some federal funds that go back to the province every so many years, and we have some provinces that receive more money than they pay in. So there is this mechanism of solidarity in Canada, and traditionally, I think provinces from the east and the northeast of Canada have received much more money than provinces from the west. And so that's kind of the way I look at this. And I'm thinking, in the EU, what I thought was really interesting was that the first stage of the question, which is, okay, should we have some form of fiscal solidarity, which is, in other words, should we have a mechanism that would go from the EU level back to the member state, was accepted fairly easily. And I'm only saying fairly easily. In other words, there were discussions and so on and so forth, but really, in my mind, the difficulty and the huge issue was the conditionality, the terms. In other words, under what conditions will that money flow? And the results, you haven't discussed the results, but what I know of the results is that there is a big part of the package which has conditions that are quite strict. And there is also another big part of the package, which is basically we give you money and you do what you want with it.
Yeah.
But with a tiny, in a way, asterisk on the side of the contract, which is, but you have to implement the rule of law as understood by the EU, and that has been a huge issue between Poland and Hungary. And so, as you are designing this survey and that you're trying to understand this, I'm sure you have discovered other layers, like, in a way I caricature the system, right? It's like we have some money that is free flow, but you have to respect the rule of law, and then you have some money that is under conditions, and obviously you have to follow the rule of law, but the conditions can be quite demanding. There is some money that is actually on loans, but interest rates are really low in the EU, so it makes Canadians in a way being envious of this, because the price of money in Europe is much cheaper than here. Yeah. And so I was wondering if there are, in a way, other layers in your expectation when you design the survey, right? Because when you talk about a disconnect between politicians and other decision makers, I was wondering if you had been able to go kind of below this and say, well, certain state had these positions, but even beyond that, certain groups had these positions, like the private sector versus the public sector, or maybe unions had a go at least, and all of this. And I'm not sure how far you guys went in, but I was thinking, was there some kind of a discussion with what I would call, the political communities of Europe beyond the states and basically the European Union in this regard, which I don't know about?
Well, it's a great question. So there is definitely in how we designed the survey. So the disconnect that we spoke about and that we are focusing on is not a disconnect between, say, the decision makers on the one hand and the people on the other hand. We are focusing in a way more on a possible disconnect that might be happening at the decision maker level, but we feel it's difficult to observe the decision maker level. But what we do know is that experts influence decision makers. So we go one level down, we look at experts. And we're looking at, okay, are experts having the same ideas when they use the term fiscal solidarity? Do they mean the same? Now, of course, And do they have the same attitudes towards fiscal solidarity? Now, attitudes towards fiscal solidarity depend on a lot of things, among which your vision of Europe and among which your political opinion, really. So the question really then became controlling for political opinion, controlling for your model of Europe. Is there still an effect of the country that you live in? That became the question. And if you get that, you will understand the rest of the presentation very easily, because that's basically what we targeted. That's how we designed the survey. So maybe what we should do is basically revisit your very question again right at the end. But I think you will get it. And what we're trying to do really is that the only thing we would like to do, since we're controlling for political opinion, what we should do is we should reach experts of the spectrum of political opinions. That's the only requirement then. And it doesn't have to be sort of that, you know, we reach people in the sort of in the right proportions. So in other words, suppose that there's like right, left, and middle, right, and that maybe in Germany sort of 30% is right in terms of economic color, and 50% is left wing and 20% is somewhere in the middle. We don't have to reach those proportions as long as we just cover the spectrum, right, middle, left. And that's what we're trying to do, because we're going to control for all those things. And then after controlling for all those things, we're going to see, is there still a different idea of attitudes on fiscal solidarity? And that's basically sort of expressed by this question. And actually sort of now is it like where you live, or is it your nationality? I think nationality matters the most. And we're asking for nationality in the survey, but we're approaching people based on where they live, right? So maybe the straight up question would be, does your residency, does the country where you currently live matter for fiscal solidarity? But of course, we also measure nationality, so there will be regressions on that one. So in other words, is there a German form of fiscal solidarity, an Italian form of fiscal solidarity, or is there rather a thing European fiscal solidarity, right? And what is the test for this? The test is basically, if you run a regression and then controlling for all kinds of stuff, if the residency dummy still has significance, statistical significance, then you can say, well, hang on, yes, there is something like a German type fiscal solidarity and an Italian type fiscal solidarity, etc. In our case, we're going to circulate this survey into 4 countries: a small country in the north, a large country in the north, and a small country in the south, and a large country in the south of the Euro area, Portugal and Italy in the south, Germany and the Netherlands in the north. And these country dummies may indicate how many varieties of fiscal solidarity there will be. And it's really, I would say this research is interesting if we find out that there's just one variety, that you can speak of something like European fiscal solidarity, and that everything else is explained by political color, macroeconomic model, etc. But it's also interesting if we find that there is a German variety of fiscal solidarity, a Dutch variety of fiscal solidarity, and an Italian variety of fiscal solidarity, etc. And so we want to remain completely agnostic about this. What are these other relevant factors? Well, the benefits of the EMU, as you see it, your macroeconomic model, I'm more like Keynesian or sort of monetarist, your vision for Europe, your political preferences, and demographic factors, right? So what's the organization for the rest of this talk? So first, a little bit about solidarity. Thomas, you will be mostly interested in this, and it's unfortunately only one slide, but we have written that part actually already. So, and then we're moving to fiscal solidarity in the EU, look a little bit about statements about it, and also what treaty terms we have about fiscal solidarity. And then I will talk a lot about the expert survey. I will give you an overview and then show you the planned main regression equation, and then focus on the regression equation and introduce the survey by basically looking at first the endogenous variable of the regression equation and then the controls. And this is like a very playful way to get to know the survey. So what do we know about solidarity? Well, sort of in the literature, there's this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic solidarity. So what is intrinsic solidarity? It's basically you are solidary, you give to others because that's what you feel is right, given that you belong to the same group of people. But your giving is without any strings attached. You do it because you feel associated with the person you give to. You have this group feeling. And you could have this group feeling in a small community, like your family, or in a very large community. You feel like you're a world citizen and you should help the people in the world. But when you give, you don't expect anything back, right? Durkheim calls this mechanic solidarity. There's also extrinsic solidarity. And here you give, and it could be but your giving sort of has the anticipation that possibly you're going to get something in return. So here it could again be because of a well-defined group. So the group could be your family, and you say, well, you're telling your daughter, you can drive the car, but you have to be nice to me in the night, right? You have to not even state that condition, but that could be the implicit expectation. So there could be sort of a type of form of self-interest, or you help out a friend in the expectation that if you ever get into trouble, your friend will help out you as well. Durkheim calls this organic solidarity. These two forms. Charity is clearly intrinsic solidarity. I would say that most forms of solidarity in the EU are of the extrinsic type, but our questions are sort of agnostic about this, and we ask the expert what they think, really. So now to the EU, so Delors had the statement, solidarity mechanisms are not based on pure generosity, so it's not purely intrinsic solidarity, but there's also enlightened self-interest, so a form of extrinsic solidarity, right? Habermas has a quote, solidarity would require Germany and several other countries to accept short and medium-term negative redistribution effects in their own longer-term self-interest. So it adds up completely with what Delors says. Again, intrinsic, no. A form of extrinsic solidarity, right? So the treaty articles, so this is the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, Article 122 and 222 are sort of solidarity type articles. The other article, 222, deals more with external threats. What does Article 122 say? So without prejudice to any other procedures provided in the treaties, the Council, on a proposal from the Committee, may decide in the spirit of solidarity between member states upon the measures appropriate to an economic situation. In particular, if severe difficulties arise in the supply of certain products, notably in the area of energy. So this is not really fiscal solidarity. This could be also sort of be direct transfers, right? And what you see here is that basically the Commission can initiate this and has to just convince the Council. The Parliament doesn't enter the story here. And Article 2 of that same article, now we're getting close to fiscal solidarity. And this Article 122 is was invoked to in the negotiation. It is the legal basis of the Next Generation EU. So here it reads, where a member state, so now it's fiscal solidarity, is in difficulties or is seriously threatened with severe difficulties caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences beyond its control, the Council, on a proposal from the Commission, may grant, under certain conditions, Union financial assistance to the member state concerned. The President of the Council shall inform the European Parliament of the decision taken. So if I'm an economist and I start thinking about this, I think, okay, so fiscal solidarity is possible in case of what somebody who works on contract theory would call it an unforeseen contingency that has a serious enough effect. And in macroeconomics, you often speak of shocks. A large negative shock that cannot be handled by the member states. The Commission can make a proposal to the Council and invoke sort of support for the member state. As such, here the unforeseen contingency was the strike of COVID-19, and this is why it became the basis of Next Generation EU. So what is Next Generation EU? Sort of this package is 750 billion euros in support made available to member states. The bulk is in the RRF, sort of, Amy, what does this stand for again? The recovery and, I'm blanking on the name, right? But it's like 650 or so is in the RRF. Of the 750 billion euros, 390 billion is made available to member states in grants, and 360 in the form of loans. But like Emmanuel already alluded to, there are some strings attached. Initially, very early on in the negotiations, there was talk about possibly invoking the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, to support member states. And this was flat out rejected to member states that anticipated to need the support, for example, Italy, because the conditionality was deemed too stringent. And Italy thought, hey, if I just reject it flat out, then I will get money, I will get support with fewer strings attached. And this really happened then. Okay, so now so now I would like to make the transition to the survey itself. So let me see if there's any additional question about the logic and the setup and what we're trying to achieve. Good. Okay. So the survey, we're approaching basically respondents in Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Portugal, and they are experts. But experts broadly speaking. We feel we didn't want to make it so hard that there's only like 5 experts in the whole world. But people with sufficient relevant expertise in either governance or fiscal policy and EMU, and from a variety of disciplines. Right? And these experts can work, for example, at an academic institution. It's the easiest to identify people who work in academia, but also at a ministry, an independent government agency, a research institute, or a think tank. So that's our target population. And to sort of nail the target population a little bit better, here's what it shows, right? So when you select, you work in academia, we want to know a little bit more, and it shows sort of the fields we're interested in, right? So if you're indicating, yes, I work in academia, you get a few follow-on questions. And then we'd like to know whether you work in an economics faculty and sort of are more like a microeconomist or a macroeconomist, or whether you work in the finance department, you work in financial economics, but also law, political science, the Department of Governance, and public admin. And so, yeah, if you see fields that we're forgetting or names that we're forgetting, given that we want to focus on that field, and please let me know maybe in the chat, right? Yeah. We also ask association with the EU in a variety of ways, actually. So we ask later on in the survey whether people have possibly benefited from an EU grant, or whether they have been on an exchange program during their studies. whether they speak multiple languages, whether they lived in other countries. We have all these questions. But in terms of testing for expertise, we ask here, for example, whether people have ever published a research paper on an EU-related topic. And then sort of, and they could be publishing on an EMU-related topic or an other EU-related topic, or both, or they haven't, right? No. And then the structure of the survey is as follows. So we have besides the demographics questions, we have in part A, questions regarding the perceived benefits of the EU and the EMU. And we would like to know whether respondents feel Italy has benefited. We'd like to know whether respondents feel Germany has benefited, but also whether the EU as a whole has benefited or the Euro area as a whole has benefited. Then in part B, we ask questions on the vision that the respondent has about Europe. And that vision depends a little bit on what you feel is the right macroeconomic model. It depends a little bit on whether you feel, for example, that EMU, as it is written with its current rules, is sustainable. Part C, I'm going to skip part C. But part D asks about what the idea is that respondents hold regarding the implications of financial support of member states in the EU and whether they feel there are incentive effects associated with support. So, for example, when you support a country, is the government less inclined to be frugal, for example, right? Part E, in a way, is the core endogenous question of this survey. So here we ask normative questions, opinions on fiscal support. What are the attitudes regarding fiscal support of our respondents? So that will be the left-hand side of the regression equation. And part F asks, in a way, about political opinion and about opinion about the macroeconomic policy of countries. And it asks, how come that some nations are poor? How come that some individuals are poor? How large a role does luck play in poverty, for example? How large a role does corruption play? And how large a role does incentive play in poverty? So that's part F. And then the main regression, so this is the core, basically sort of, so when we collect all the data, we like to do statistical analysis. And the regression line is simply that various measures of attitudes towards fiscally supporting other member states, so various measures of fiscal solidarity, how do these depend? I'm forgetting the most important variable, that's funny, but how do these depend on these factors? And then what is the most important factor I'm forgetting? The country of residence, right? So I should press in bold here, plus country of residence. And that means that controlling for all these factors that we know matter a lot, is country of residence still an important explanatory factor in explaining attitudes towards fiscal solidarity? So that's the logic here. Okay, just moving on now. So this is a slide I'm going to stick with for a long time. So let's first look at the endogenous variable. So that's in part E of the survey. I'm going to now flip and share another screen with you. And can you see the screen here? Are you now into Acrobat? Is this working? It's not working. Okay, so then I'm going to unshare, stop my share, and reshare and share with the survey. Here we are. So this should hopefully work.
It works.
So we're going to move to part E here, right? We're in the demographics part E. It's a long survey. So these are the type of questions we ask. And part E was the hardest, actually. So first we ask, say, foundations for possibly fiscally supporting a certain member state. So what are the principles that you're looking for in order to even just discuss it, right? Whether fiscal support should be granted. And then we have a whole host of things. People can click multiple answers here. Okay, so, and we're saying very clearly beforehand, listen, by selecting it, you're not agreeing yet to provide fiscal support, but it's basically what could be the basis of discussing fiscal support of member states. It's a very important question, and yet it was a very difficult to ask question, right? So what are the valid justifications for you without committing here? And then in the remainder of the question, we talk about conditions. And we split the conditions for fiscal support into two types: prior behavior of the member state and conditionality, in other words, quid pro quos. So here's prior behavior, right? And we ask these questions. So suppose that a member state fell victim to what is called a natural or man-made disaster in the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, Article 222. So there's a natural or man-made disaster. In this case, would you find it reasonable that donor countries provide fiscal support conditional, that they conditional on the prior behavior of this member state? And the question is, again, check all applicable answers below. So one answer could be, no, I find it inappropriate. Help should be provided unconditionally, right? Then you would check this one. No, conditions on prior behavior would be inappropriate. And, or you can check, well, it's not necessarily inappropriate, but it's not helpful. It's undesirable, right? Or you can say, well, I do feel that in any event, the member state should have respected the EMU rules, whichever they are, right? Or you can check, well, no, yeah, the member state should have behaved in a fiscally responsible manner. And later on, we then ask, what do you mean by fiscally responsible manner, right? So many people in the Netherlands would claim, well, Italy has not been fiscally responsible because they've allowed their government debt to run up to levels that are unsustainably high, or at least possibly unsustainably high. But again, we tease that out later. So here we just give it as an answer option. Yeah, the member state should have behaved in a fiscally responsible manner. If you check that, it means that you agree to that, even though we don't know yet what you mean by fiscally responsible manner. Or you can say, yeah, the member state should have demonstrated to respect, here's Emmanuel's criterion that he mentioned earlier, respect the rule of law and the other values of the EU, the other core values of the EU listed in Treaty Article 2. And yes, if applicable, the member state should have also supported similar cases in the past. Right? So this is what happened. So these are your answer options for this one question. The answer options for the other questions are essentially the same, but the cases are a little different. So here we talk about a case. Let me see, do the highlights work? No, I cannot highlight anything. The case here is a natural man-made disaster. Here we're going to sort of talk about a large negative shock. And it would be interesting to see whether people would find large negative shock different from a natural man-made disaster. Case. Yeah.
If I look at those two questions, and I think of your questionnaire, you're going to have trouble getting people to fill in a long questionnaire.
Yeah.
Right? Too many people are getting bombarded with these kind of things. And if I look at E1, E2, and E3, and I go, why don't you just make that one questionnaire? I mean, you know, what's the difference between a natural or man-made disaster and a large, unpredictable shock outside the control of the member state?
Yeah.
Let
me just make a note of that, because it is true that one of the final few decisions we need to make is whether we need to trim it before sending it out. And you are right, this is a long survey. So the people who have so far sort of worked on the pilot, they spend about between 17 minutes and 45 minutes on the survey. It's a long survey.
Yeah, that's too long. I've been asked to fill out surveys 10 minutes long, and I start them, and if I hit the 10-minute mark, I go, whoop, too much.
Yeah.
And I kick myself out.
Yeah, that's also a thing I don't like, to basically signal upfront that it's a really short survey, and then it turns out to be quite long, right?
Yeah.
But you're advocating for further trimming it down, and you may have a point, and I think we may do that before.
Oh yeah, you've
summing
got
it
to
up.
trim it down.
Yeah, that was your first question, or your first remark.
Yeah, that was it. Well, my other remark dealt with Sweden, which was kind of off topic at this point.
Yeah, we'll do that later. Yeah,
Yeah.
over a virtual coffee. Yeah. The third question is again sort of prior behavior, but now it talks about the public debt level of a member state becomes unsustainable. So this is slightly different, because here it may be considered to be the fault of the member state that it became unsustainable. And the question is yet again, do you feel that support should be granted, and what should be the conditions, right? Then the next questions go into conditionality. So conditionality, the answer options are the same and the cases are the same, but here we ask, hey, is it reasonable? What quid pro quos would you be asked for? Well, actually answer option is not exactly the same. So conditionality would be inappropriate or undesirable, or you could say, yeah, it's reasonable to ask for a fair rate of interest for the fiscal support received. Yes, we should. It is reasonable to ask that member states commit to implement certain structural reforms. Yes, it is reasonable to ask that the member state commits to taking austerity measures. And yes, it is reasonable to ask whether the member state sticks to this treaty article. So this one is the same, right? And same for 6 and 7. So these are, again, sort of in terms of our regression, these would be revealing the opinion you have on fiscal solidarity and would become part of the endogenous variables, right? Then here we tease out what do you actually mean by fiscally responsible behavior? And here is, okay, if we grant fiscal support, right, and decide about the instrument for fiscal support, it could be, say, a Eurobond, or a grant, or a direct transfer of some sort. Who decides on this? And the answer options are, well, there should be a dominant role for creditor countries, for the suppliers of the funding, dominant role for the recipient countries, negotiation, blah, 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 right? Yeah. I think you get a sense, right? So these are our endogenous variables. So let's now sort of look at the controls. For your answers to these questions, E2 through E6, and some of the other questions, well, your political opinion plays a role, your macroeconomic model plays a role, the benefit that you think that EMU and the EU bring you play a role. So let's look at some of those controls. Let's first talk about that last point. So what about the benefits of the EU? That's basically we try to capture that in part A. And we have statements of, we first define what we mean by benefit, and we say, oh, that's economic benefit in terms of economic growth, right? So that's the preamble. And then the statements are, the EU single market has benefited Germany, has benefited Italy, has benefited the EU as a whole. And then we ask people to compare these two things. So this is some question that perhaps myself and my co-author would answer differently, right? How do the per capita benefits of Germany and Italy compare? And then that's the EU and the single market. Now let's look at EMU, and EMU can be split in a number of components, right? So EMU, first of all, means, well, overall, has EMU benefited the constituencies? So that's the overall question. Maybe Kay says that afterwards I should stop here, but EMU has benefited Germany. The euro has benefited Germany. The euro has benefited Italy. the euro area as a whole, and how do the per capita benefits compare? And here we sort of decompose the benefits of EMU. So one way the benefits could have sort of arisen is through the cost of borrowing, through the interest rates, right? So has EMU lowered the cost of borrowing for the German government, all other things equal? What do you think about that? Same for Italy, same for the EMU on average. And what about the spread? Has the spread between the government bonds of Italy and Germany come down, or has it rather come up? Did EMU play a role? In these answers, I'll always we always give the option that you say, well, I'm an expert, but with my expert opinion, I gotta say that the effect is unclear, right? And we also give an option, I have no opinion, right? These two things mean different things in this context. Then what about exchange rate flexibility? Super helpful in a zone which is not in a currency zone, right? So this lack of exchange rate flexibility, has it benefited Germany, Italy, etc.? What else? The monetary policy. Some people say, okay, the ECB's monetary policy is catering towards Germany. Do our respondents see this and feel that this is the case? So the questions are, do you believe that the ECB's monetary policy choices have benefited Germany, benefited Italy, have benefited the euro area as a whole, right? Because some people are against EMU, right? We also want to capture those people. So that's part A, right? Where the control would be the perceived benefit of the EU and EMU. Now moving to part B. In part B, we talk about the vision for Europe that we have, and also a little bit the macroeconomic model. And in particular, we wonder whether people feel that EMU is basically a mistake, and if it's not a mistake, whether it's incomplete and what needs to be fixed, right? So let's look at questions B2 through B5 here. So question B2 basically asks for that question, hey, was it a mistake and should it be reversed? So the statement here is the euro area is not an optimum currency area, and the lack of nominal exchange rate flexibility implies that trade imbalances are hard to eliminate and therefore ultimately making EMU unsustainable. Ultimately then, it would be best if the euro area disintegrated, albeit in an orderly fashion. So that's one narrative that you hear, right? So what do you feel about that narrative? Next one. Here we have a narrative of another type of economist, right? Another type of expert. EMU would actually become sustainable provided the EMU countries would agree to carry over some automatic stabilizers from the national level to the EU level. For example, a system of employment benefits at the EU level. It becomes then more like Canada, right? Thus, the current EMU rules plus some additional automatic stabilizers would suffice and avoid a structural divergence between euro area countries. Here is a slightly more extreme version of that. So this is basically somebody who feels that EMU is almost ready to run and almost sustainable. The only thing we need is some automatic stabilizers. And B4 would represent the opinion of somebody, or would tease out your opinion about should the EU become a proper fiscal power, right? So the question is, EMU is sustainable provided that it evolves towards a proper fiscal union with significant additional fiscal powers at the EU level, so United States of Europe, right? Next, implementation of necessary structural reforms would eliminate trade imbalances, hence establish convergence of the euro area economy. Therefore, the current EMU rules are almost right. They almost get it right, but what is needed for the EMU to become sustainable is a system that ensures implementation of necessary structural reforms. So it's going to be a hard-nosed person who feels that, hey, you know, The problem is not the rules, the problem is the implementation of the rules. And the last one, B6, sustainability of EMU requires two changes. First of all, EMU needs to become a fiscal union. And second of all, the government of member states must implement structural reforms as needed, right? So that's another very important control, because your opinion on these questions will impact how you feel about fiscal solidarity. Two more to go, guys. So first, what is the effect of fiscal support, and are there moral hazard issues associated with fiscal support? So you hear a lot about these moral hazard issues in the press, right? And there's moral hazard issues of several types. So that is what we work out in part D. So let me move to part D. So first of all, part D asks about the benefits of current mechanisms, the ESM and next generation EU, and also asks about possible spillover. So if Italy is supported, will that spill over back on your own country? Right, so that's the question in D3. So all EU member states benefit from next generation EU, either directly or indirectly through spillovers, right? What do you think? Good. So now the incentive effects. So here's just an example of an incentive effect type question, D5. I'm not going to discuss all these questions. So here is the question, the statement: allowing member states to borrow through the issuance of Eurobonds would weaken the incentives of governments to behave in a fiscally responsible way. D6, same question, but now for the ESM. D7, same question, but for next generation EU. D8, same question, but now it's borrowing funds through the European Union or a common agency institution. So this actually looks very much like Eurobonds. So in D8, we actually tried to tease out whether people feel, we tried to tease out indirectly how people define Eurobonds in their head, right? So that's one possible incentive effect, and that's the incentive effect on possible fiscally responsible behavior of member states. Another incentive effect that is related but not the same is about implementation of structural reforms. So we have the same question, but now it's the question, how about structural reforms? And the last questions are asking about need for possible fiscal support, right? So is there even a need, right? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So that's the penultimate control. And the last control is political color, but we're trying to look at political color in terms of redistribution and in what is the effect of luck in accumulating wealth and the effect of working hard in accumulating wealth. And we try to do that both at the country level and the individual level. So I'm just going to give you some examples here because I realize we've been going for an hour and I want to just draw close to a close. But here is, so I call it on the wealth of nations and individuals, right? So one, the wealth of nations, it's Adam Smith, as you know, right? But the question, the statement here is bad government policies and or corruption are important factors explaining why some nations have a low per capita GDP. Or is it bad luck? Or are there structural factors, maybe like trade agreements, that lead to differences across nations? Then we move on to individuals. What is the role of safety nets, such as unemployment insurance, health insurance? Do safety nets make the economy function better? Do you agree? Or do you say, well, it's not that they make the economy work better, function better, but you do this because they avert individual tragedies, right? So these are the next F8 is interesting maybe to highlight. In wealthy countries, the reason for the possible poverty of individuals is often bad luck. Right? Do you agree? Or can you avoid poverty by working hard in a wealthy economy and in a developing economy? Again, it teases out your idea about the macroeconomy and also about microeconomics, but also your political color, right? From a redistribution perspective. So this is enough about the survey. Let me just stop sharing the survey and go back to the presentation, because we have discussed it. Very big slide here. Where are we standing now? And then I'm opening it up for questions. So we have identified 250 or 300 experts in Germany, even many more in Italy, about 800, but in Italy it's mostly academics. The survey, I feel, is almost done, but your feedback is very much appreciated. The pilot has started. If you're keen on helping me for like up to 40 minutes, let me know and I'll send you the pilot link. And if you can do it, great. Even if you receive a link and you cannot do it, I'd understand. And we're going to send out the survey tomorrow or Thursday. And while the survey circulates, we're going to collect details of experts in the Netherlands and in Portugal. And the intent is to actually write everybody with their name. So, dear Professor Lubesman, what do you think? Can you please fill out this survey? This is where we are. Let me just stop the share and open it for questions. Yeah.